I'm here to welcome you to Union Days, our kickoff event. And is this too loud? Okay, is this good? Okay, that's right. If you want to add more and stuff, you got to sing loud. Anybody know the quote? It's Arlo Guthrie from Alice's Restaurant. Okay. Anyway, this is really very exciting. My name is Risa Lieberwitz. I am a faculty member here in ILR in what used to be called the Department of Labor Relations, Law and History. And now we've merged with the International and Comparative Labor Department. And so now we're the global, what are we called? Global Labor and Work. So that's the department I'm in now. And I'm delighted to welcome you to Union Days. We have some people who are also joining us online. We're doing this as a hybrid event, and they will have a chance to ask questions later. But the reason I'm welcoming you is that I am one of the people on the Union Days Planning Committee. We do this every year as an annual event, and this is our kickoff event today. As you probably know, Union Days is part of the Worker Institute at Cornell. And Union Days has been around for many, many years. And we have this as our annual event celebrating the labor movement. We do other things to celebrate the labor movement as well, but Union Days is an important part of our spring events. So let me just tell you a little bit about the Worker Institute before we launch into our program today. The Worker Institute at Cornell is part of ILR, and it engages in research and education on contemporary labor issues. And one of the most exciting aspects of the Worker Institute is the work that we do with students. ILR students and other students as well have the opportunity to be active with the Worker Institute. And there are lots of opportunities if you are interested in learning more about it for students to work with the Worker Institute faculty in Ithaca, as well as in New York City and in other parts of New York State. And in doing that work to also become involved with work with various unions and other social justice organizations. For example, we have a very successful ongoing program of student research fellows who work on a variety of projects involving labor rights and equity for all workers. And what I'd like to do now, before again we get into the main show here, is to thank some people for all the work that and support we've had for Union Days. So I'd like to thank the ILR School generally for supporting these events and the co-sponsors of Union Days, which include various ILR offices, other Cornell departments, academic departments, and student and faculty organizations. And I'd like to thank the Union Days Planning Committee, which is made up of ILR and Worker Institute faculty and students and staff. And I would like to first start with special thanks to our amazing and wonderful student committee members who are here. So wave when I say your name. Our undergraduate student members, Danielle Donovan, Nick Wilson, Grant Moravec. It's not my student. That we're expanding, and our graduate students Alejandra Quintero, and also Della Walters. And I also want to do special thanks to the ILR staff for their extraordinary work on Union Days. I don't know if they're here, but we can thank them whether they're physically here right now or not. So Emily Cotman, who is and Pam Goldner as well, who's fantastic. And Jen Morley, who's a member of ILR communications team and who's done wonderful work in publicity. And right in the back there is Mike Haslett, who is doing the work. He's waving from the little booth there. So again, welcome to Union Days 2023. So our theme this year is Talking Union. And I lived in the South for a number of years, and it's a very sort of Southern way of saying you're talking union. And we're doing union and talking union here with our kickoff event today. And we're talking union on university campuses. In April, next month, we'll be continuing with our Talking Union theme with more Union Days events, which I'll announce at the end of our event today. And also, let me just remind you that when we're done with the event here, we're going to have an informal reception with some snacks outside on that, up on the first floor, I guess it is, right outside in the atrium. So you'll get to chat with the speakers and each other after today's event. So for the last couple of years, just a couple of introductory remarks for you on our topics today. For the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk in union and a lot of union organizing and collective action. As you probably know, approval ratings are up about unions and the work that unions do at 70% approval ratings. Union elections are up, as are victories by unions in those elections. And we've got unionizing and collective bargaining, which takes place now across a wide range of occupations in the US, some of which people didn't expect, like in the tech sector, like Apple and Activision Blizzard, the service sector, including Starbucks and the REI department store, and in universities. Now that's been going on for a long time, but we see a real uptick among faculty and graduate employees, as well as undergraduate employees who are engaging in unionizing and collective action of different kinds. And that's our focus today. We have an exciting panel of speakers from all of these groups who will share their knowledge and experience about unionizing on university campuses. And our speakers are ready to speak with you today. And I am going to introduce our first speaker, who will be both the moderator and the speaker for today's panel. And then she will take it from here. Our first speaker is Julie Schmidt, Executive Director of the American Association of University Professors, the AAUP. And she had, And Julie has many years of experience in unionizing on university campuses, starting as a graduate employee at University of Iowa. And she's been a union organizer for the AFP and for the AAUP. And since 2013, I got the right year, right?
I believe so.
Yeah, since 2013, she's been the executive director of the AAUP, the national AAUP, where the headquarters are in Washington. And she's done such interesting work that I know we're going to hear great experiences that she's had and analysis. And so I'm going to leave it to Julie to be our first speaker and to also introduce our other wonderful panelists. So thank you.
Thank you to Risa and the committee for inviting me and for organizing this panel. I'm really excited to be here. And it gave me an opportunity to think back on my experience organizing on campuses and to realize, my God, I started doing it in 1993, which means I'm very old, which is very sad to be reminded of. But before I start, I'm going to introduce the panelists and then I'll talk for a few minutes. I mean, it's lovely that there's a clock up there because I will keep an eye on that. And then we'll turn it over to the panelists. And basically what I'm going to want to do with my comments, just so folks know, is I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences organizing on university campuses starting in 1993, because I actually, looking back on it, think there are some interesting antecedents both to organizing techniques. Emily and I got to take a cab together from the airport and talk a little bit about that, but also it's what some of the challenges are that we're seeing, especially with grad employees and faculty organizing. So before we get into that, I'll just introduce folks and then I'll just kind of jump into my comments. And what I hope to do is just kind of frame some ideas and maybe leave some breadcrumbs for us to pick up and for the panelists to pick up on, and then for us to talk about during the discussion part. So to my left is Katie Haber, and she is an executive board vice chair for the Student Workers of Columbia, which is UAW affiliated, and excitingly an ILR alumna, so that's very cool. To my immediate right is Ian Scott, and he's a bargaining committee member for the Dartmouth Student Workers Collective, which is an independent union. And then to my far right, but not politically, is Emily Lozier. And she is the former co-chair of the Northwestern University Graduate Workers and the current organizer in the chemistry department. And I will just point out, interestingly, she and I have the same, I'm a United Electrical Workers alumna as well. So she and I have the same, come from same union parents, I suppose. So just a few things. I've been thinking a lot about this since Risa asked me to come up here. And, you know, one of the things that really struck me that's interesting about organizing on campuses, and I think that has really shifted over the past 30 years, is really a sense of labor consciousness in a way that it didn't really exist in 1992 or 93 when I went to my first union meeting. I grew up in a union household. My mom was a K-12 teacher, but we didn't think of her as a union member. It was so inherent or ingrained in her professional identity as a K-12 teacher that it wasn't like teacher plus union member. These two things were sort of, I never really thought, even though I walked strike lines with her, I never thought about her as a union member. So that's kind of interesting. And so like most people, I didn't go to grad school expecting to be involved in union organizing. I went to grad school thinking I was going to become an academic. When I got to Iowa, though, I found pretty early on in my career there, I got invited to a meeting organized by some rhetoric and English grad instructors who wanted to talk about working conditions on the campus. And I got there and found out I was we were talking union. We were at an organizing committee meeting. So Iowa had an so I became involved in that organizing drive fairly early on. We had an unsuccessful election in 94, lost by 70 votes. And people at that point thought, well, this is dead in the water. And it was not. Like, we had a party, kind of Irish wake afterwards. And immediately at that event, somebody said, well, when are we going to try this again? And we all realized we were going to try it again. So we ended up then affiliating with the United Electrical Workers a little bit later in 94, having a union drive in 95 and a successful election in 96. What I didn't know until about maybe 6-7 years ago, when somebody was doing an oral history project and they came to interview me, is the COGS UE election of 1996 was the largest public sector employee union victory in the country at the time. It was a huge deal. You have to remember, this is not that long after, it feels weird saying this, at the time it felt like that was way in the past, but not that long after PATCO, not that long after really these yeshiva, this really kind of concerted, first wave of concerted attacks on private sector unionization in the country, right? So union density was on the decline, and we didn't think that what we were doing was something remarkable, but in a way it was. So that was really neat. We organized for some of the usual reasons people organize, and I'll kind of touch on those, but then something that's a little bit maybe unique that I think informs a lot of what's happening on campuses today. And so obviously bread and butter was a huge issue, the economics, right? I mean, this is 1993 money, but the average quarter-time grad assistant was paid around $4,000 a year. The average pay for a part-time assistant ranged from $8,000 to $12,000 a year, depending on department. There was no, and Emily and I talked about this on the drive over, but especially in the sciences, but we saw this also in education, there was no mechanism for enforcing work hours. So even though like you were being paid for a 20-hour a week appointment, sometimes you were in the lab 60, 70, 80 hours a week, right? And there was no wage and hours claims, right? Nothing you could really do about that. Health insurance was non-existent. This was before Obamacare. You couldn't stay on your parents' insurance. So there was no health insurance. You could buy a policy for $525 a year. That number's burned into my head. I didn't even have to look it up from the university, but it was a catastrophic plan. We literally called it, you had to get hit by a bus to get healthcare plan. And we did not have tuition remission. We got in-state, they would give you in-state tuition, but there was no tuition remission. So those were the economic issues that animated the organizing campaign. But any of you who've been involved in an organizing campaign know that economic issues are really not just about money. They're actually about power, right? And they're about voice. And that was a big part of it too, was really dignity in the workplace and recognition for the work, just the fundamental work we did for the institution. There were 2,600 of us in the bargaining unit at the time. I think it's a little bit bigger now. This was University of Iowa at the time did not have a lot of adjunct labor. They really depended very heavily on grad employee labor, both to run labs, but also to teach. And the vast majority of the general education courses were taught by grad instructors. We weren't TAs. We were not, running sections for a professor. We were instructors of record. We had developed our own syllabuses, our own curriculum, had no oversight really. But we had no voice, right? We weren't involved in any decisions that happened in the department about teaching. And obviously, the students paid, just like with adjunct labor now, contingent labor now, undergraduate students were paying the same tuition no matter who was teaching them, right? So this was an issue as well. The third issue, which I think is perhaps unique and maybe not, we'll hear when we talk to our other panelists. So I want to do them in that order. Yeah. Was academic freedom was a really big issue at the University of Iowa in the mid-90s. And that sounds kind of strange maybe for a grad union to have that as a front and center issue. But there had been this incident at the University of Iowa in the art department in about 1994. And an art history student showed a movie called Taxi Zoomklo in a class, which is a homoerotic art film. And, I'm from the rural Midwest. God loved the Midwest, but it flipped out parents, it flipped out legislators. This was a very, it was a red trifecta state at the time. And it flipped out the Board of Regents. And there was all this talk about, what the hell are they teaching the good students of, the university over there? So the Board of Regents put in place something called the Unusual and Unexpected Classroom Materials Act, first trigger warning in the country in higher ed. Yeah, go Hawkeyes. This policy required instructors to inform students about any sexual materials that were going to be taught in the class. It was clearly homophobic, okay? So that was the initial policy passed by the Board of Regents. Well, the University of Iowa president, who actually ended up coming here after his glorious career at Iowa, I won't speak his name, but it rhymes with, well, anyhow. Without the faculty senate approval, actually doubled down and added to the policy these words. And that you couldn't teach any material, you needed to give students adequate indication of any unusual or unexpected materials in the classroom. And if they were uncomfortable, you couldn't teach it to them. Now, I was in the English department. I taught Flannery O'Connor, who is sort of a fairly leftist Catholic writer. And I had students who were like, I was raised evangelical. This is unusual and unexpected to me. So the language was just so broad that it really made it incredibly difficult to teach anything to an undergraduate on the campus. The interesting thing about this policy was really the only individuals, even though it was a blanket policy to apply to anybody teaching in the classroom, the only people who ever lost their employment under this policy were graduate employees. And as those of you who are graduate employees know, if you lose your employment, you oftentimes lose you lose your economic support, you lose your ability to actually complete your graduate education as well, right? I mean, this came up recently at TUGSA when they started changing and charging people tuition, right? Basically making it impossible for grad employees to continue their studies as part of the, crackdown on the labor. So this is what was happening at Iowa. So something called the Campaign for Academic Freedom started protesting the policy on campus. Well, this is where it gets really interesting. So the University of Iowa administration then moved to ban protesting on campus. It's a public university, so you can think about is that legal? No. Did they try it? Yes. And again, even though this ban applied to everybody, the only people who were ever punished under it were grad students, grad employees, and undergraduate students. Faculty, even though many faculty protested as well, they were kind of protected, probably because of tenure. So that really fed into our union drive. A lot of the people who are active in CAF, the Campaign for Academic Freedom, also became active then in the union drive. So for us, I think, Katie and Emily can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it's typical for grad employees to sort of have academic freedom as a central organizing issue. But for us, it really was because of sort of the material circumstances on campus at the time, right? The other thing that we really tried to make front and center, and, in retrospect, I have a lot of critiques of, because this was 30 years ago, and I think we've learned a lot more about anti-racism as white folks, but we tried to make anti-discrimination and anti-racism front and center as well. And it was a major organizing issue for us. When we won our election, we're negotiating our contract. One thing we wanted to do was get the state's anti-discrimination language in the contract. The administration resisted that very strongly because it said it's already in the state constitution. You don't need it in the contract. We're like, we want it in the contract so we can grieve it. And so we fought really hard on that, including the 11th hour, almost going to mediation and binding arbitration. We did not get it in the first contract, but we did get it in the second contract. So that was a big win for us. So those are just some of the, those were some of the issues shaping our campaign. And like I said, I see those as sort of some breadcrumbs for us to pick up on maybe with the later discussion. I also wanted to just quickly touch on my experiences in Wisconsin. Fast forward 12 years, I'm in Madison. I'm working for the American Federation of Teachers. We were organizing the UW system, which had just gotten legislation. And one of the really interesting things that happened was it was extremely successful. We were organizing, we had 7 successful union elections in the 13 campus system. And then the 2010 red wave happened. Scott Walker got elected governor, and what's called Act 10, which was a Koch funded, ALEC developed piece of legislation called the Budget Repair Bill, went through. And what that did, it was an anti-union bill. It got rid of the ability to negotiate anything except wages, and not even benefits, I believe, for state workers were excluded, but wages. Like, people actually started getting their contracts printed on Post-it notes, because we went from having like 30, 40-page contracts to it was literally a recognition clause, an expiration clause, and like 1 or 2 articles. So that happened. Interestingly, what happened in higher education was so for municipal workers, and one has to remember, Wisconsin was the birthplace of public sector unionism. AFSCME started in Wisconsin in the 50s, right? That's where. So this happens, and union rights are curtailed for municipal workers, which include K-12 teachers in Wisconsin, and state employees. For the UW system, they're completely repealed. So all these faculty who had just voted for unions on 7 campuses had their unions decertified, not because the workers on the campus decertified the union, but by the fiat of the state, by the stroke of a pen. So this happens. And I was talking to Risa over lunch, and I was saying one of the really, I think this was after you left, Emily, one of the really interesting things that came out of that, in retrospect, the full repeal in the UW system softened the ground for what then happened in 2015, which was in another budget bill. They love budget bills there. That was Scott Walker's thing. Everything was a budget bill. In another budget bill, they went into the state statute and basically changed tenure so that with post-tenure review, any dean or provost could get rid of a faculty member and got rid of shared governance. So there was a way that what was really clear, at least for me from this, was that associational rights, the right to organize, the right to collective action were completely tied up in other kinds of rights, like the right to academic freedom, for instance, at the university. The one other thing I want to point out about Act 10 is that, and this doesn't get talked about enough, is the way the bill was a budget repair bill is it took a lot of public good, state land, state waterways, water rights, state utilities, publicly owned utilities, and transferred them to private corporations, many of which could be then traced back to the Koch conglomeration. So it was this massive transfer of wealth from the state, from the people to the private sector, which, you know, I think, again, there's this nexus there that is probably something we want to talk about. So I'm going to wrap it up there so we can get to other folks. You know, but I just want to say my breadcrumbs, I think I want us to kind of talk about, just to come back to them, is, you know, I think what we see happening in places like Florida and Texas right now underscore this point. We can't and we should not and cannot mistake attacks on education and the freedom of inquiry, the freedom of thought is separate from attacks on collective action and collective rights. These things are entwined, right? If you take a state like Florida, what we're seeing is they ban books. They criminalize K-12 teachers teaching certain books. They go after tenure. And last week, the anti-union bill dropped there. These things are not unconnected, and we have to see them as connected. And I think the reason we have to see them as connected is because both are really necessary for a vibrant civil society. And when you start pulling on one, the other one goes with it. I think that's part of what we're seeing. I think the other thing that, you know, we were seeing the storm clouds on this in the 90s, but again, Emily and I were talking about this in the car, and it's some over from the airport, is, you know, and I think we really see it in our post-COVID world, is just how completely neoliberalism has sort of infected the academy and what the impacts of that are, not just on the workers, but the students. And I think COVID really laid that bare in some pretty extreme ways. That maybe there was sort of a little bit of a, you know, patina over it. We weren't really seeing it as clearly before. And I think COVID just kind of busted that open for a lot of people. And I think probably some of the organizers on this panel are going to talk about that a little bit. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. I mean, I guess, yeah, I'll stop there because I think the rest of this will come up in part of the discussion. And I want to make sure we hear from our other panelists. So I'm going to turn it over to Katie here in a minute. And I already introduced you. So I guess, is there anything else you want to say besides being an ILR alumna and a UAW member and organizer of a campus? Oh, and a sociology PhD student. There you go. All right.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. I remember when I was an undergrad here, I used to help set up the ILR union days. So It's weird to be on the other side. So I'll tell you a little bit about the kind of history of the union at Columbia, and a bit about my involvement, and then I'll talk a little bit about like some of the lessons that I've learned at the end that I think could be relevant. And so this is really a story of very major union busting, and also the power of rank and file organizing. So the story of the union, the Student Workers of Columbia, started way before me. I think the first organizing started in the 90s. And, you know, in response to like poor working conditions, power, you know, all of the things that you talked about. But it really picked up, I think in 2014, when the teaching assistants and research assistants filed for a petition with the NLRB to become a union. And this was right after NYU had just got recognized, their grad union had just got recognized. So basically, when that happened, that led to like a 2-year showdown in the NLRB deciding whether or not private grad students at private universities were workers or students, and whether or not they could be members of a union. And in 2016, the board finally ruled that Columbia grad students were workers and could organize. And all TAs and RAs at private universities across the country could unionize. And so when that happened, the union asked Columbia to recognize the results of the election, which they won, and Columbia was like, no, we're going to fight this. So Columbia hired an anti-union law firm, Proskauer Rose. I took labor law in the Proskauer Rose room at ILR to go to the NLRB and fought this for years. But in 2017, they upheld it. We became a union, and then Columbia was like, okay, great, we're not going to bargain. So then we spent another year fighting. This was all before I came. Spent another year fighting that, went on strike. And then basically what happened was during Thanksgiving break of 2018, Columbia and some members of the region of the UAW got together behind some closed doors and made an agreement that Columbia would come to the table and bargain if we gave up our right to strike for a year. This was not consulted with anyone. And so that led to its own kind of big fight where a lot of people wanted to vote this agreement down, but eventually it passed. And so we started bargaining. That was in the fall of 2018. So I started grad school in 2019. I had just graduated from ILR, worked for a year. I'd been wanting to study labor. I'd been pretty active at ILR in this group called COLA, Cornell Organization for Labor Action, doing a lot of like labor organizing. And so I was pretty excited to get involved. We were in the middle of bargaining our first contract. And I quickly became involved in this group called the Columbia Academic Workers for a Democratic Union, which was basically a reform group within the union trying to, you know, have the union run by the rank and file as opposed to kind of staff, union staff, and trying to focus more on like democracy within the union, democratic decision making. And one of the things that this group CADU fought for, which would be really, really important later, was open bargaining. So basically that was that we would not bargain with Columbia and private. All the members of the union could come. Bargaining had to be public. So that bargaining was happening. Nothing was happening. They were just like not moving. We were basically bargaining against ourselves. And we were gearing up to go on strike in the spring of 2020. When the framework agreement expired. And so as we were heading into the strike authorization votes, obviously COVID happened and everything shut down and went online. So what happened then was basically a lot of people's lives got derailed. Columbia was kicking people out of their apartments. people were like stuck outside the country, couldn't travel, people had no more childcare, you know, people's lives were being derailed in very serious ways. And the university was just not doing anything about it. A lot of people felt that they were kind of making it worse, especially with the housing situation. And so there was a vote to go on strike. And we went on strike. At that point, it was without the approval of the bargaining committee, who did not endorse the strike despite it having been voted on. And so we went on strike for a few weeks online, trying to figure out how to do that. And we basically ended up getting a summer like extra money of $3,000 for everyone of extra funding. So after that happened, we kind of went back to bargaining and continued bargaining over the summer and the fall, but there was, you know, not a lot of progress. And so in spring of 2021, we decided to go back on strike. So we had a strike authorization vote. We went on strike. And it was going pretty well. It was a pretty creative strike, so it was hard to do. We did both in-person pickets, which were small because a lot of people were still not on campus. And we also did virtual pickets, which were, you know, calling Columbia, calling administration, trying to get faculty support, calling local politicians, things like that. And during this whole time, bargaining had been on Zoom, so people were getting really involved. So there would be like 200, 300 people in the Zoom room, which I think was the most important thing we could have done, because there was 200, 300 people in the room hearing Columbia's lawyers who got paid $1,000 an hour say, we don't believe you deserve a living wage. You're just not providing this value for us. And then people would come and give testimonies and be like, I don't have money to feed my kids. And they would be like, sorry, that's not our problem. We don't care. And so people got really mad. And so after that, we continued on strike. And then the bargaining committee basically unilaterally voted to pause the strike after a couple of weeks and decided to enter mediation with the university. Despite a lot of people being very unhappy with this. And things went a little bit downhill from there. So we kind of conceded everything, including like all our, you know, asks for wages, protection from harassment, discrimination, things like that, health insurance. But we got a tentative agreement really fast. I think after like 2 weeks in mediation. So the good thing about having all these people who are plugged in now was that a lot of people were really mad and they were like, hey, we didn't bargain for 3 years for this contract. We deserve much better than this. And so this kind of big movement happened for a vote no. And so we ended up organizing for a few weeks really, really intensely, you know, going to labs, going around campus, like contacting everyone in our department just to tell people, hey, you should actually maybe read the contract before you vote on it. Just know what's in it. And while we were doing that, we found out that the tentative agreement that had been proposed was actually going to cut a lot of people out of the union. So a lot of people, like hundreds of people or thousands who had been on strike were not even going to be covered by it. So eventually we, by a miracle, achieved this historic no vote. I think it was the first no vote in higher education. We voted down the tentative agreement and we reelected a new bargaining committee. And so that bargaining committee went back to the table in the summer of 2021 and started bargaining. And then we decided we're going to go on strike for real this time and we're going to do it properly. And so we had this new model when we went on strike, which was like everything was written by working groups. So it was grad student workers who were writing the contract language. It wasn't staff, and we were organizing ourselves. It wasn't the union staff that was organizing. So everything was very democratically run and rank and file run. And I think that really gave us a lot of strength. And so we went on strike in the fall of 2021, ended up on strike for 10 weeks. And it was really intense. So during that time, Columbia basically cut our pay. So people were not getting paid at all. And they also were telling students, I mean, I had students email me and be like, I don't understand why you guys are on strike. Don't you make like 80K a year? And like, oh, we make like 30 and we live in New York City. And so they basically were like, you guys don't care about your students, you're abandoning your students. And we were like, no, but how can we be good TAs if I have 50 students in my section and I don't have time to grade everyone's work or give them feedback or have them come to office hours? That doesn't work. And so we went on strike, and it was a really amazing strike where we like really held each other together. And we had like mutual aid, like a GoFundMe distributing money to people who needed it. We were able to keep it going. And we did these huge actions, like we had like a big march from the medical center to the main campus. We had the shut it down day where we like blocked off all the entrances to the campus. And things got really intense because Columbia was like, we're gonna fire all of you and not hire you back next semester, so no one's gonna have a job. And basically what happened was that all the unions in New York were like, no one's going to scab. So people from CUNY, the New School, NYU, like everyone was like, signed a petition that's like, we're not going to take your jobs. And so we continued bargaining through winter break. And the thing that they really didn't want to, I mean, there was wages and healthcare they didn't want to give up on, but the main thing they didn't want to give up on was protection from harassment and discrimination, because the way that it worked was that basically, if someone, your professor or your PI harasses you or discriminates against you, Columbia investigates themselves, and a lot of the times find that they did nothing wrong. And so we wanted a neutral outsider to do that, and they did not agree to that. And so I think the biggest thing that came out of our strike was actually getting them to agree to that after they had said basically over our dead body. So we won the strike, got a contract, and for the past year, we've been doing the hard work of building our local. We became a new local, UAW 2710. Columbia has been violating our contract since day one. People are getting sections with like 50 students, 100 students. People aren't getting paid. So we're having to kind of teach ourselves how to file grievances, how to build a union, all with just rank and file run. And so just two very quick things that I will say are key takeaways are, the really important things that I think helped us win was this focus on democracy and rank and file unionism. Like if we didn't have open bargaining, if we didn't have the working group structure, like we would never have been able to win anything. And so no matter what we do, we try to focus on bringing people in, whether it's through bargaining or a contract campaign or a grievance. It's just how to get people more involved. And the other thing was the role of solidarity and other unions, and that if other unions had not stood with us, then we probably wouldn't have been able to make it. And now we're, happy that we're talking to a lot of other unions and trying to stand in solidarity and support each other. So, yeah.
Ian.
Hi, my name's Ian. I'm a junior at Dartmouth College, a part of the bargaining committee and the organizing committee for SWCD. And so kind of the arc of my little spiel here is mainly about our experience of using the union as a tool for revolutionary struggle at Dartmouth College. And by that, I mean, when I got to Dartmouth, I had a certain kind of image of what the landscape was going to be. My dad was an alum, and he had, while he was there, been a part of like the anti-apartheid struggle. This was like in the 70s and the 80s, when, the Black Power movement was, still in its heyday. The Pan-Africanist movement was still in its heyday. And kind of the stories of all that, coming up, I kind of came in expecting, the battle lines to be clear, in the sense that it was then. They would talk about in like some of the Black student newspapers at Dartmouth, like, the idea of being behind enemy lines while you're at Dartmouth College. And, being a guerrilla, in that sort of sense. And so I came there expecting all of that. And then I got there and I realized that all that, that entire history, that entire culture of dissidence had melted away in like the 40 years since. And, we're talking about neoliberalism. And I think at Dartmouth, what I've learned is that neoliberalism's one of the greatest tricks that it has done is that it has like rebranded what like the right wing culture is. And the right wing culture is less so now the outward, fascism and stuff like that. It's still here and it'll come when it's needed. But it really, the majority of sort of right wing ideology at Dartmouth is like apathy and nihilism in the sense that we have like the Dartmouth Review still, back in the 80s, it's like the Dartmouth Review was the titan, of the right wing. But now it's kind of like a caricature, and people don't really pay attention to them, and so the sort of idea that there is, sort of opposition or there are differences and there is struggle at Dartmouth doesn't exist. People are very inward thinking, very individualist in that sense. And so when you're trying to push like a left agenda, at that school, it also is able to be easily marginalized as well because there is no tangible opposition to it. You're made to look like, someone that's like spitting in the wind, someone that's just making a fuss. And so when I got there, it was me and, a small group of other students who had were kind of like-minded in this sense. And we're, thinking of Dartmouth as a complex that, you feed in students and it spits out managers for neoliberal capitalism, and that it spits out bankers, it spits out engineers for weapons companies, it spits out, politicians, it spits out academics who promote, ideology that, secures the interests of the United States. And we were thinking, how do we create an organization that is self-reproducing, that where Dartmouth takes in students and spits out, neoliberals, we spit out revolutionaries. And so at that time, what the material conditions that emerged, that we were seeing at the time was mainly one, COVID. In that it was creating, a very sharp sort of contradiction in the student body among, low-income students, among international students, undocumented students, students coming from working class families, first-generation students, so on and so forth. And so this mainly emerged in Dartmouth dining services, where, our union has started at. And Dartmouth Dining Services is primarily composed of students of color, of Black students, of, working class students. And during COVID, we all come in and we have our financial aid agreements that say you have to have a work study. And so as a freshman, you come in, you have to have a work study. You don't know any professors to do research with or anything like that. And they're always hiring at DDS. And so that becomes pretty much your job forever, pretty quickly in. And so, especially during COVID, Dartmouth was trying to do that hybrid thing where you'd have students here, but they're taking Zoom classes so that people wouldn't defer and they'd lose their tuition money, another manifestation of this profit, driven system at Dartmouth. And so, students, as freshmen, first time on campus, are frontline workers, in the pandemic. And so are facing the highest demands because there really is nowhere else to eat besides the main cafeteria. These shops are mostly entirely student run. And so they're facing these long lines, heavy demand, little pay. I think at the time, the wage was like maybe like $10 or $11. You got sick, you got COVID, you just lost that time. Those were just wages lost. And so that went on for about a year. And in that time, we had started trying to agitate around that. We had founded a chapter of the Young Democratic Socialists of America and revived a left publication called the Dartmouth Radical, and started putting out, all these stories, having these talks, having these political education meetings about working conditions. At the same time as well, there was a rash, and there's still a rash. It's an ongoing sort of attrition of the student body by suicide, where we've had several students, in the past few years, commit suicide, and that is another thing that Dartmouth manages, where when there is a high enough risk for someone to harm themselves or to kill themselves, they send them away to make it, to like manage, the liability that Dartmouth has. And so, that's another thing that we had started agitating around, and students, both as workers and then in the community are getting frustrated with these conditions. And, thereby we're able to sort of agitate and make these battle lines clear and say these things aren't happening out of like random circumstance or tragedy. It's not just life that you're getting poor wages. It's not just life that you're stressed out. It's not just life that your friends are dying, but it's Dartmouth is like the focal point for all this stuff. And so through that sort of steady, consciousness raising in October of 2021, we had our first, it was like a midnight meeting of a bunch of us, YDSA members and DDS workers and people who were both at the same time getting together, basically talking about, we're fed up. We've been trying to, negotiate with the college on our own terms. They're not really, budging. We want to go on strike. And so, we, in that meeting, hammered out, we can go on strike now, but if we want these wins to be permanent, we have to have a union, we have to have a contract. And so that then led us into our union drive. And then January of 2022, we had gone public with the union after getting like 80% of hard signatures from our unit, which was about 200 at the time, 200 total, and then we got 80% of that. We went public immediately. Dartmouth, had raised our wages and given us hazard pay, like a 1.5-time raise, and then sick pay as a way of maybe trying to like buy us off early on before it got too far. But again, we just, use that to further, sort of legitimize, the idea of a union. And so we were making, 1.5 time. Some of us were making, I was making as much as like $22.50 an hour at the time, washing dishes. A lot of people were making the same thing. But then, and then we like went into our election and we won that unanimously. And then we went into contract bargaining. And around that time we went into contract bargaining, Dartmouth was also, letting go of, its COVID restrictions, because it was no longer, they didn't need to look good anymore. It wasn't in the national consciousness anymore. And so they moved from like mandatory testing to self-reporting. And they had a stipulation in their sick pay thing that as soon as COVID infection rates went down below a certain percentage, it would go away. And so because people were self-reporting and people who get sick, they're like, oh, I'm not going to tell anybody. I'm not going to miss classes, all this stuff. COVID sort of ceases to exist, even though it still very much happens. People still get sick all the time. And so we lost our hazard pay and our sick pay. And that really just, push people further to want, higher wages out of our contract. And so our contract platform became, getting, the bread and butter, sort of stuff that you're talking about, a $21 an hour wage, paid time off, so on and so forth. And then we also had some sort of ideological, more ideologically driven positions on like, say, BDS commitments for Dartmouth Dining Services, because we only believe that a labor union is effective insofar as it is connected to anti-imperialist struggle, and all that stuff. Yeah. But then, we also had, basically we had a position that we weren't going to accept a no strike clause. And so we go through like 10 months of bargaining. And in that time, we're having rallies, we're having, various different sort of actions as Dartmouth continues to not budge on certain points, especially on wages and like no strike. And we got to this point just this past term as we're at the end of this contract struggle, where we found ourselves in a position where, basically Dartmouth switched out their lawyers, where they first were having an associate or something from Morgan Brown and Joy, and then they upgraded to a partner. And so the partner comes in, and this guy was not playing around, and he basically put us into a position where we felt like we had to figure out what exactly we had to give for them to give us wages. Like, oh, we'll trade this, they'll give us that.
Yeah.
And so, what we had to realize is that we weren't playing a game of trading. We were, as you're saying, playing a game of power.
Mhm.
And that we were in a position where they had the power to say, oh, well, we're not going to move, and you guys haven't been moving. That whole we need you to meet us halfway thing, it doesn't mean anything. It is only something that means something when you have the power to make people feel like it's true. And so what we realized is that we had to get out of this. And what we were determined to do is that we said, listen, every single rally, the card check, the election, all of these actions that have happened over the past year plus have been preparation for a strike. It has been, for training, our unit for being able to move when we call the strike, to have the machinery of our union, in place to actually facilitate a process like that. And so we went about the business of getting that strike authorization vote. Within a week, we got to 99%, authorization. And the college had realized that we were about to go on strike, or that we're going to impasse. And so they started kind of panicking and sending us, more things, going to the position that we were in just a week prior, trying to send us piecemeal things to, get us to back away from the red button. It was very gratifying, to see these emails with these little proposals coming in, and to not respond to them and then give them, just letting you know, we have authorized a strike, and you have 24 hours to respond to our package deal, or we will be going forward with calling the strike. And at 4 o'clock the next day, they got on a Zoom call with us, and they're like, they accepted our wage deal. They accepted, 2-year duration for our contract, so we can ensure that there is always, every class of student at Dartmouth College will go through the experience of bargaining a new contract. And then, oh, is that an echo? Basically it's weird hearing, but we got the wage deal, we got the 2-year duration, and then we also maintained a strike clause where we were able to strike over ULPs and able to do sympathy strikes and not cross picket lines for the full-time union at Dartmouth College. And so now we're moving on to expansion and, whatever that will entail. It also, led to them trying to preempt us expanding to other unions, or expanding our union by raising the minimum wage to $16 an hour for everybody outside of our unit. And so basically the lessons that we gained from this again is that through this process, where we started off in 2020, not knowing if we're able to strike, not knowing if we're able to unionize, we got to the point of being able to do both. That union struggle prepares us for that higher phase, because as you're talking about with the legal decisions that have happened that take away worker power,
Yeah.
To think that the union is a set thing and that we just get there through that struggle alone is basically waiting for another Reagan revolution to come through and like wipe us all away. And so we use the union so that when we get to that point of crisis again, we're able to move on to the next phase of revolutionary struggle, whatever that may look like.
That's
Yeah.
a great. Makes sense. All right, and last but not least, we have Emily Lozier. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, how do we do that?
It's the button. Should be.
How's that sounding?
Is it echoing?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Turn that back on.
All right, yeah, so we're all good then. Sweet, well, I'm Emily Lozier. I am very pleased to say now I'm the former co-chair of Northwestern University Graduate Workers, Youth Local 1122. So we just recently, within the last few weeks, elected our bargaining committee, which I'll get into kind of the basically whirlwind of the last year, with some context first about our history as a grad union, and a little bit of background for myself, but then really focusing in on just like what the process is like, very much focused around a recognition election, just since that's the stage we're at, but also with an eye to how you take that kind of infrastructure and leverage it for the struggles that come after both the contract, but also understanding that we shouldn't just be limited by what we feel is traditionally possible in a contract. But to Ian's great point, see it as part of a larger tool for struggle and also in solidarity with other workers and groups, both on campus, but also in the communities that campuses occupy. So just to give a bit of background, I am from Minnesota myself, grew up in Wisconsin though. My formative years in high school actually really coincided with the Act 10 business and Scott Walker's, campaign of terror, as it were. And for me, that really hit close to home. My great aunt was a public school teacher in Cudahy. I attended public schools all through high school. And I was, the student newspaper I was on, my advisor was a union steward for the public school teachers union. And so it very much was something that cut close. And there are folks I know who went and were part of the 100,000 people occupation of the Capitol at that time. Those of us who were still at school walked out and read impassioned speeches off bits of lined paper on top of picnic benches. But ultimately, of course, that ended in this really bad outcome for public sector unions, with the exception of first responders unions, notably police unions in Wisconsin. And that really, I think, set the tone of both the power of unions, but also the ways in which, it's not, the fight isn't over simply with having the union. A union can still be declawed, defanged, and ultimately is a game of power. So fast forward, I had just graduated college. I had done my degree in chemistry and was looking to do research as a graduate researcher. I was looking at a few places. I visited Northwestern, where I ended up going. And during my visit weekend there was a panel from graduate workers talking about just student life, as it were. And having unions on my mind from my high school experience, I asked, hey, is there any grad organizing happening on campus? And this panel of all chemistry students. No one, it was just sort of blank stares. So I was like, all right, never mind. But later that night at a dinner, another chemistry student who hadn't been on the panel found me and said, hey, listen, there's this group on UGW on campus. They're organizing. You should check them out if you come here. And so I did end up going to Northwestern. This person had piqued my interest in the way that many of us, especially in STEM programs at Northwestern are. I was very, very busy my first year. I was teaching, I was doing full-time research. I was taking classes as well, preparing for, qualifying exams down the line. And so really there was like no extra spot in my brain to think about like, oh, what is this, that I'm doing here? Is it school? Is it a job? What is it? By the time then, I got to thinking about union organizing more in earnest. It was my second year, and I looked around and realized I was really one of the only people in a department of 250 chemists who was thinking about unionizing. And I found luckily a very extensive community of folks who had been organizing for years in UGW from other departments, but there really was a clear question in my mind of, where's the union's presence in STEM? I will kind of return to that question a bit later on, but I want to use that as just a brief segue now to the history of NUGW because it predates me significantly. So NUGW started in 2016. It was founded by a group of core organizers and had it start in email threads and little meetings in classrooms. And it followed in the wake of the Columbia decision that was referred to. It was very galvanizing for a lot of folks to see, hey, this is possible, we can do this. And that kicked off a recognition campaign with this nascent organizing committee affiliated with AFT at the time. There was a card campaign in 2016 that, or it might have been 2017, but in any event, there was an unsuccessful card campaign. We failed to reach the 30% threshold of card signed to trigger an election. And at that point also that coincided with the election of Donald Trump and the advent of a fairly anti-union NLRB. And so the judgment made that we wanted to switch our focus at the time to more issue-based campaigns and see like, what can we win right now for graduate workers that, isn't predicated on having a grad union. So what can we just do through like exerting collective action? And that was actually fairly successful. During this time, we had successful issue campaigns surrounding getting 5 years of guaranteed funding across the board, which wasn't the case originally. A lot of folks were cut off in the summer you lose your funding and then, what are you supposed to do to live to complete your research, right? Complete the degree. We were organizing with master's students as well. There was a DMA continuation fee that was very onerous. We organized to get that, cut. Similarly, there was an international student technology fee that was imposed really to basically cover Northwestern's costs. We have like a nice reporting software that was required of them, and we agitated around that and got that put out as well. And so this actually is when I was starting at Northwestern myself around this time. We were still in the issue campaign phase. And so, I was attending these organizing committee meetings. I was having little, strategy sessions with, an older organizer from philosophy. And, he'd ask me like, oh, how's it going organizing chemistry? And I was like, I don't know, it's like 250 people and me. And like, I tried sending an email and like no one answered. So I don't know, and so it was very isolating. But obviously like you can't do anything just on your own. The thing that really kind of switched things over though, in terms of this kind of character of there being minimal STEM presence was, COVID. And particularly, I want to take kind of a STEM angle here. We were, in early March in a place where there, our primary kind of product as grad researchers in STEM departments actually is primarily, knowledge and publications and like really turning those out. And there was a very strong feeling that things had to continue at all costs. And there wasn't people who had never, thought of themselves as workers before were seeing like, oh, I'm facing kind of a reality where I'm gonna have to go into work in person because my PI is demanding it. it seems like I'm gonna have to go work my usual, 50 to 60 hour week. And, what is the protection in place for me? We had in chemistry a pretty dramatic town hall where it was early Zoom days. So department leadership didn't know to shut down the chat yet. And people were, like jumping in there, sounding off, like radicalizing each other and pointing out like, look, this department doesn't care about your safety or my safety. We have to care about our safety. And that was very telling. At the time, I was like, oh, this is a great opportunity. I started jumping in there and putting like the link to join NUGW in the chat. Around that time too, then there started to be like an appetite of discussing like, what would it mean for us to actually demand more in this department? And so that's where things switched over. There was like a group of us in chemistry who were meeting actually, and we started having organizing committee meetings. And that was really fantastic. It was like a case of like, needing to have workers organizing workers, and not just like graduate workers generally, but like really there's so many types of work that we do in the institution. It's so different from department to department, program to program. It was very important to be able to talk to folks who got it, who understood what you were going through, who understood what it was like to be a bench chemist, say. That was a lot of good momentum. So now to kind of like bring us into, that was all like the COVID organizing. It was primarily virtual, but it was very galvanizing for the movement in a big way. Even though we couldn't organize in person, there was more energy than we'd ever seen before. People were angry in a way that they weren't before, and willing to do something about it. And we also took the opportunity around that time as well to strengthen our department level organizing. As I alluded to, like understanding that the people who are going to understand you best, who you're going to understand best, are your coworkers, your immediate coworkers. And like that was the ground game we wanted to carry out. So sort of coincident with late 2020, we made the decision as well through an internal referendum to disaffiliate with AFT, and had spent some time independent working on our internal infrastructure. In the spring of the following year, we had a grad needs survey that we got 1,900 people to fill out. And there was a unionization question at the end that like over 90% of people responded favorably to. And we also were able to develop a platform based on the responses of that survey, which are representative of our bargaining unit, going in, prioritizing stipends, healthcare, similarly, a way to have like professional standards in our labs and classrooms with regard to extra work, extra pay for extra work, standards around graduation. In the summer and leading into fall, we made the decision to affiliate with United Electric. And that was a very galvanizing moment as well, because I think, we had this really great structure, but we needed like the confidence to really put our foot on the gas. And that was a very, like, I think good partnership for us, and things really took off. In October, we dropped cards and had a super majority signed up in under a month. And then we filed with the NLRB in early November. We negotiated a stipulated agreement that included a description of the bargaining unit that included fellows, which we were really excited about. In December, we also like asked for, a very early election date and got it in January, January 10th and 11th, we caught the car, as it were. And then it was like, oh my God, time to organize over like winter holidays when everyone's like home and just doesn't want to be bothered. But we pushed through that. We got like a majority of folks pledging to vote yes, and confirm plans. And, then it was, I want to say smooth sailing, but it was a struggle, but we got through it. And having the election in January with, I believe it was 1644 voting yes to 114 no votes, which we were very happy with. Now to the stage 2 where we're heading into bargaining now, and wanting to kind of put more thought into this question of, how do we maintain the organizing engine from the election, knowing that that's going to be just as key for bargaining. It's not enough that we just want our union. The union is the tool, we got it. And how sharp and how powerful it is going to be really a function of how we wield it. So looking forward to figuring that all out. And it's very inspiring hearing from other folks as well. I guess I'll say, yeah. So.
I want to thank everybody. Am I back on or am I on? I don't know. I want to thank everybody. I mean, these are great comments and there's so much to work with here. I'm just looking at the clock. I wonder if we should, if there are questions from the audience, why don't we start there? And if there isn't, I think probably some of us have some questions for one another, but we'd really like to start with you. Oh, I'm sorry. Straight back.
Hi, how are you guys? I'm curious as to like your figure the trade tactics as you're organizing, like you use like social media and stuff to get out there, especially during these times of pandemics. How are you guys leveraging that and kind of give us advice if we decide to go out? Like, what was your strategy?
Yeah, I would say Canva is like your best friend. Also, if you have someone that draws, like I do some art myself and it's like, I did like a bunch of like propaganda, as it were. You know, there is like, every time something happened, like say in bargaining, they were first gonna give us like $18 an hour and we didn't want that. And we had a rally about it and we had a bunch of people do testimonies and stuff. And then they came back and they said, okay, we'll give you $18.50. And so I made like a poster that was like a hand holding up 2 quarters. And it said like, we gave them our lives, they gave us 2 quarters. And so you do stuff like that, just like every and anything, whatever like medium it's on, if it's like an Instagram post or an infographic or a tweet, you take whatever the situation is, whatever like your bosses are doing, and you turn it and you spin it in a way that, gets your unit more fired up and more committed to the work that you're trying to do.
Yeah. I'll just add to something that we found during pandemic organizing. So it actually was a really big turning point for us in STEM to be able to do walkthroughs of labs. And the reality was a lot of people were like, I was back working in person in June 2020 and worked through basically entirely. There were big concerns around PPE, especially. Northwestern used to provide masks. They no longer do readily. They like technically have them, but it used to be super easy at like kiosks at doors to all of the labs. And when you're, a busy researcher, of course, you like just being able to just grab it and go is great. Same with testing. It's been really abysmal. Something that we found is a really great way to connect with people was to table in front of buildings with like basically PPE care packages. With like N95 masks and like literature about unionization and Jolly Ranchers, but why not? And like, that started a lot of great conversations. It was a way to connect with people. It was a very tangible showing of like, hey, we're your coworkers and we need to take care of each other. And so like a little bit counterintuitive in a way that like, it was COVID organizing, but it was still like in person. And we found generally that I used to be a very like Twitter heavy campaign, but the thing that really allowed us to take off in this last year was meeting folks where they're at. And that requires being creative with COVID, but it also is like an opportunity to organize on the issues that COVID makes us have to organize around, in fact, and in the ways in which like the university has failed us and made, that kind of organizing more difficult anyway. So, yeah.
I think I saw somebody in the black hat in the back. Yeah.
Oh, thanks so much for coming. I know a lot of your work is focused on grad students, but what are your message to undergrads who may be interested in this study?
Well, yeah, I'm an undergrad organizer. Just do it. I was actually, we did an interview, I think, a couple weeks back after we won the contract. And we basically said in that, like, just take our numbers, our positions on the contract and like make it higher, because with undergrad organizing, especially right now, it's a very new, area. And every victory like sets a precedent as to what we can do. So every time, we say, okay, we won like $21, some other school right now is like bargaining for like $30 an hour.
Wow.
And so it's like, when you go into bargaining and like $30 an hour is the highest contract that you see in the undergraduate world, you go tell your school that, and you're like, this school can do it, why can't you? Because they all have the money. It's about, whether whether they want to give it to you. And that's again, where that power game, comes in, but yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think, so at Columbia, our union actually used to be called the Graduate Workers of Columbia, GWC. But while we were organizing, we had a vote to change the name to include undergrads, because a lot of undergrads also work these same STAs and RAs. And so I think that's really important, because the thing that all employers like to do is when you exclude someone from the bargaining unit, then you can change job names or reassign work to those people. And then eventually your unit gets smaller and smaller. And so having the most people in the unit is like really the most important. But alongside that, that's been going on a lot of other cool stuff, like the resident advisors at Columbia have been organizing because they basically used to get paid very little and have to deal with, like someone like dies in their dorm and you have to deal with it, and you're like 20 years old and, no one trains you how to do anything about that. And so like they also organized, I think they are filing for election, or they did, I'm not sure. But I think like all, having more unions is always makes all the other unions stronger. So everyone should do it.
Yeah, and one thing Katie's pointing out that's really interesting is how work that used to be faculty work shifted to grad employees. And then as grad employees became a more unionized sector, right, it's starting to shift to undergrads. And AFSCME has this brilliant model, because a lot of those public sector jobs started getting outsourced and privatized, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, where they, instead of just organizing public sector, now they organize private sector workers who are doing work that used to be public sector. And they have this thing called what they say is we follow the work. And it's interesting to think about that as an organizing model, because we've always, I think, given and this gets to some of what the folks here have talked about, with sort of maybe being a little broader, thinking kind of a little more creatively about how we build power. The legal structure in this country is really focused on bargaining units, right? And sort of defining work categories in a way that, I think, especially in a very hierarchical environment like the academy, like higher ed, can disempower. And I think what you see with a model like what you're talking about is what your folks did, your organized committee did, is it really talks about what is the community of interest, what are the shared interests, what are the shared goals, and how do we build that power together? And I think that's something to think about too with organizing. And I mean, I find the work that organizations or the unions like CWA are doing, where they're organizing the whole like organizing the whole campus, is a really interesting model when you look at how the work is being shifted. Every time a group of workers organizes, the administration shifting it to an organized group. So I saw you and then somebody over here. Oh, two people over here. And then I don't know, Risa can tell her, or Nick can tell us what the time is.
Why don't we take like an extra 5 minutes and these people can stay, and then we'll continue talking.
Okay.
I just want to say first, thank you so much, all of you, for speaking. It's been a really pleasure to hear about all this work that's being done. I wanted to ask, especially Emily and Ian, about strategy, kind of going off the first question, especially in the early days. We heard from both of you kind of about how you brought in broader campus issues, broader organizing into your campaigns, and that helped you build kind of the groundwork for the union. And I think that's kind of a gray area that not a lot of people think about when they're traditionally thinking of unions. And so I would love to hear how you guys approached it.
I mean, I can give kind of a microcosm of because by the time I started, NUGW already was kind of rolling, but in my department, at least, there really was no presence. And so it was in a way kind of like a microcosm of starting out and making the case about unionization, why people should care. Generally, I found that it was very helpful for folks to feel that, well, first of all, that you were starting off from a point of listening to them and from empathy and meeting folks where they were at with their issues. And that's something that we try and have in these structured organizing conversations, is really starting from a place of issues, not just what I think your issues are, but tell me what your issues are. And like, let's connect over that. I think like that was very key for people to have it pointed out to them the way in which what's bothering them in their lab. With their, their PI's mismanagement, with all the demands on their time, the way they're expected to wear, 5 or 6 different hats, and yet, they're still struggling to, are going into credit card debt when an unexpected medical expense comes up. Like, what's up with that? People are generally like feeling miserable, but we don't always have the words to connect with each other on why we're feeling miserable and connecting it to something more systemic. And there's actually something very affirming in having a conversation with folks where they feel heard in that way and can have kind of like come to that conclusion themselves of like, oh, look, this is not something I'm alone in, and this is something that we can fight together on. And so always bringing it back to the issues was important. And then further in terms of strategy for getting started, I would say just like giving an expectation that this is our fight was important. It was really important in chemistry for us to start our own organizing committee and take ownership and feel that it was our job to get our people organized. And, not our, job to sit back and have like, philosophy students or sociology students come in and do that organizing for us from a place of more experience. Even though like the folks who are more experienced organizers were coming from different departments, at the end of the day, the folks who are going to be able to connect the most on the issues were each other within our departments. And so that was how we really tried to get ground games off in all of our different departments. So really that department level structure is so important. And that's where like, once we were, kind of had that in mind, walkthroughs, which in the past had been tried by our organizing committee and have been pretty unsuccessful in STEM, frankly, and actually generated some like ill will. And once we had like a dedicated group of like STEM workers doing walkthroughs of STEM labs, like we were aware of like the social dynamics of a lab. You could tell when there was a PI looking over someone's shoulder. You could tell when someone was like working with a pyrophoric and you should probably not mess with them. Things of that nature. That actually built up a lot more trust and like made it so walkthroughs could actually be generative in a way where they like built relationships and were able to kind of like form the basis for us to like expect from each other that we are engaged union members and part of this fight together.
And I'll add quickly, it's like, to your point, it's just constant like clarification. And again, for us, like our publishing arm, was a lot of work. It's not like our official publishing arm. It's like our newspaper, but it's like everybody that does the newspaper does the union. And so they're pretty much the same thing. Hopefully we can get to a point where we have enough people where all these organizations, are like manned by different people and stuff. But we have like a yearly disorientation guide. So every time freshmen come to campus, we put out this guide. We make it in collaboration with, other groups on campus, feminist groups, Black student orgs, migrant justice groups, so on and so forth. And sort of as a collection of, here are all the issues that exist at Dartmouth that they don't tell you on like the recruitment brochures. And here are like the places that you can go to like join, the sort of struggle, so to speak. Comes through that. It comes through our social media posts. It comes through just like constant clarification just on like you're talking to people. Like, it is something that I talk about pretty much. I get annoying sometimes because this is all that I talk about. It's just always, when someone brings up just like the littlest thing, I try to like connect it back to, the austerity regime at Dartmouth College and stuff. But yeah, it works after a while, and then especially as well, like thinking about it like dialectically, it's like when this union stuff started picking up, we had a response from the sort of culture that confirmed the things that we're talking about, because, we start going out and we're talking about the bread and butter issues, and we're not even mentioning, race, but then, it's like all of the racists, come out and all of the classes come out, and like the contradictions again, get really deepened. And in some ways, I consider Dartmouth like conceding. While we won, they kind of won too, because what the strike would have done is it would have really exploded things, in a physical way that heretofore hasn't been seen at Dartmouth, in my time there. If you actually had, these cafes shut down where it's like everybody that's working behind the counter is black, everybody that is like, buying drinks is white, and, pay and, their 80K bill is on like auto pay, and they never like an ILR or a FAFSA form. And so, and when those stores get shut down and then those people don't get their drinks and then they start getting mad, again, this is something that becomes more potent, and so, those are the two ways that we've seen it happen, on our campus.
Do you want me to get the two last questions? Yeah.
Hi, we're going to have the continued discussion outside, don't go anywhere. Outside with some light refreshments. And so what I'd like to do now is two things. First, join me in thanking this extraordinary. And one of the reasons that we did the reception is so that people can keep talking. It can turn into a teach-in out there if you like. And there'd be plenty to talk about. And then before y'all go, I do want to just get in your mind, Peyton, that in April, we're going to have more union days on April, and we'll be sending out posters. I know you get sick of seeing them, but you're going to see them. We're going to have an April 13th panel on Southern workers organizing. Step Up Louisiana is going to be here. Union of Southern Service Workers, the United Mine Workers Auxiliary for a couple of locals. That's going to be great. And then on April 17th, we have our ILR labor leaders in residence who will be speaking. That'll be Chris Smalls, president of the Amazon Labor Union, and Derek Palmer, vice president, Amazon Labor Union. And then on April 25th, we'll have another talk by Ellen Cassidy, who's one of the co-founders of 925, which you probably know from reading about it and seeing the movie. So we've got a lot more to do and a lot of unionizing, a lot of organizing to do. But again, I'm just so impressed with this panel and the richness of the discussion. So please join us up there and keep talking union. Okay.